In the small, peaceful town of Willow Creek, where life moved at a slower pace and everyone knew their neighbors, there was one man who stood out from the rest. His name wasn't important to most people, he was simply the guy with the lakefront ranch. The ranch itself was something straight out of a postcard, rolling green fields that led down to a sparkling blue lake, a weathered wooden fence lining the property, and an old fishing boat docked near the water's edge. For James, this place wasn't just a home, it was everything. James had spent years building it, pouring every ounce of energy he had into making it perfect. After retiring from the military, where he'd served as an Army Ranger for over 2 decades, James wanted nothing more than peace and quiet. He didn't care much for fancy things or keeping up appearances. All he wanted was to sit on his porch in the evenings, watch the sun dip below the horizon, and listen to the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. But as it turned out, even paradise has its problems. About 6 months ago, letters started showing up in James's mailbox. They were official-looking documents with shiny logos and stern language from the local Homeowners Association, or HOA. At first, James ignored them. He figured they were just routine notices about community events or maybe reminders about dues he paid those on time, so what else could they want? But then the letters kept coming, each one more insistent than the last. It seemed the HOA had issues with his property. According to them, his wooden fence didn't match the modern rustic aesthetic they were trying to enforce across the neighborhood. The fishing boat parked by the lake? That was apparently unsightly and needed to be removed. Even the color of his barn doors drew criticism, they weren't neutral tones, whatever that meant. James couldn't believe it. Here he was, minding his own business, and suddenly these strangers thought they had the right to tell him how to live on his own land. At first, James tried reasoning with them. He sent polite replies explaining that he liked his fence the way it was, thanked them for their suggestions, and left it at that. But the HOA didn't back down. Instead, they doubled down, sending longer, harsher letters filled with threats about fines and legal action if he didn't comply. James shook his head every time he read one of those letters. Who were these people to dictate what he could do with his own property? He hadn't broken any laws, he just wanted to enjoy the life he'd worked so hard to build. One sunny afternoon, while James was tinkering with his tractor in the yard, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Looking up, he saw 2 large men stepping out of a black SUV parked outside his gate. Both wore matching uniforms, black pants, dark shirts, and shiny badges pinned to their chests. One of them carried a clipboard, while the other held some kind of walkie-talkie device. James wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to meet them. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The taller of the 2 men spoke first. "We're here on behalf of the Willow Creek HOA. We've been authorized to conduct an inspection of your property." James raised an eyebrow. "An inspection? For what?" "For compliance with HOA regulations," the man replied, glancing down at his clipboard. "As you know, there have been multiple violations reported." "I know exactly what's been reported," James interrupted, his tone sharpening slightly. "And I'm not interested in letting anyone onto my property without a warrant." The second man stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Sir, we're asking nicely now, but if you refuse, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." James didn't flinch. He crossed his arms over his chest and stared at them evenly. "You're welcome to try. But let me make one thing clear, I've dealt with bigger threats than you 2 in my day, and I don't scare easily." For a moment, nobody said anything. The tension hung thick in the air as the 2 sides faced off. Finally, the taller man sighed and nodded to his partner. "Fine. We'll go for now. But this isn't over." As they climbed back into their SUV and drove away, James felt a pang of unease settle in his gut. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. If anything, it was only the beginning. And deep down, he realized he'd need to prepare himself for whatever came next. Because if there was one thing James had learned during his time in the military, it was that sometimes, standing your ground meant being ready to fight for what you believed in. James stood on his porch long after the black SUV disappeared down the gravel road, staring at the empty space where it had been. The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. These weren't ordinary neighbors dropping by to borrow sugar, they were hired enforcers, sent by the HOA to strong-arm him into submission. He'd seen their type before, people who thought wearing uniforms and carrying clipboards gave them authority over others. But James wasn't about to let them push him around. He didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the old house made him glance toward the window, half expecting to see headlights pulling up outside. By morning, though, he knew sitting around worrying wouldn't solve anything. If they wanted a fight, he'd make sure they regretted picking one with him. After all, James had spent 20 years learning how to handle situations like this, not through brute force, but through careful planning and preparation. This wasn't just his home, it was his sanctuary, and no amount of intimidation tactics was going to take that away from him. The first thing James did was reinforce the gate at the entrance of his property. It was sturdy enough already, but he added heavy chains and padlocks just to be safe. He figured if they came back, they'd try to force their way in again, and he wasn't going to give them an easy opening. Next, he went to work setting up motion-activated floodlights along the fence line. They weren't there to blind anyone intentionally, just to make sure anyone sneaking around at night would think twice about staying hidden. But James didn't stop there. Over the years, he'd picked up plenty of tricks during survival training exercises in the military, and now seemed like the perfect time to put some of them to use. He dug shallow trenches near the gate, covering them with loose boards and dirt so they wouldn't be obvious unless someone stepped right into them. Not dangerous, but definitely unpleasant. Then, he rigged tripwires connected to buckets filled with slippery mud. Again, nothing lethal, just enough to slow anyone down who tried to barge onto his land uninvited. By the time he finished, the place looked less like a peaceful ranch and more like a low-key fortress. James chuckled to himself as he surveyed his handiwork. Some might call it overkill, but he preferred to think of it as being thorough. Besides, he reasoned, if the HOA really cared about aesthetics, maybe they should have thought twice before sending goons to harass him. While James worked on fortifying his property, word of the confrontation spread quickly through Willow Creek. Small towns have a way of amplifying drama, and this was no exception. Neighbors whispered about what had happened, speculating whether James had gone too far or if the HOA had finally pushed someone past their breaking point. Opinions were divided. Some folks admired James for standing his ground, especially since many of them secretly resented the HOA's constant meddling. Others thought he was asking for trouble by refusing to cooperate. A few neighbors even stopped by to check on him. One older woman named Ruth brought over a plate of cookies and told him, "If I were younger, I'd join you out there with my rolling pin." Another man, a farmer who lived a couple of miles away, offered to lend a hand if things got ugly. "They mess with you, they mess with all of us," he said firmly. James appreciated the support but assured everyone he could handle it. Still, knowing that not everyone in town hated him gave him a small sense of relief. As the days passed, the tension grew thicker. The HOA hadn't contacted him directly since the initial visit, but James knew better than to assume they'd given up. In fact, he suspected they were planning something bigger. Sure enough, late one afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, a formal notice stating that failure to comply with the HOA's demands would result in further action. There was no specific threat, just vague language meant to intimidate. James read it once, then tossed it onto the kitchen counter without another glance. He wasn't afraid of words on paper. What worried him more was the uncertainty. How far were they willing to go? Would they send more guards? Try to involve the police? Or worse, sue him and drag the whole thing into court? James had faced danger before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about protecting himself, it was about defending his freedom. His right to live the way he wanted, without someone else dictating every little detail of his life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, James sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. He stared out at the lake, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. For a moment, everything felt peaceful again, like the world outside his fence didn't exist. But deep down, he knew the battle was coming. And when it did, he'd be ready. James leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. He'd always been a fighter, not because he enjoyed conflict, but because sometimes fighting was the only way to protect what mattered most. This time, it wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about proving that some lines shouldn't be crossed and that respect had to be earned, not demanded. Whatever happened next, he vowed to stand firm. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a fence or a boat or a color scheme. It was about dignity. And James wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. The morning started like any other in Willow Creek, quiet, with the faint smell of dew hanging in the air. Birds chirped lazily, and the sun peeked over the hills, casting long shadows across James's property. But James didn't feel calm. He'd been up since dawn, keeping an eye on the driveway. Something about today felt different, like the calm before a storm. And sure enough, just after breakfast, he heard it, the low rumble of engines approaching. James stepped out onto his porch, squinting toward the road. 3 trucks rolled into view, each one bigger and more imposing than the last. They weren't subtle about their arrival, parking right in front of his gate, blocking the entrance completely. Out climbed 6 men, all dressed in black tactical gear, looking more like soldiers than security guards. One of them carried a megaphone, while the others fanned out, inspecting the perimeter. Their leader, a tall man with a buzz cut and a clipboard, stepped forward confidently. "Mr. Callahan," the leader barked into the megaphone, his voice echoing off the trees. "This is your final warning. Open the gate and allow us to conduct our inspection, or we'll take further action." James didn't move. He stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching silently as they postured and shouted. Part of him wanted to laugh at how ridiculous they looked, all that gear for a dispute over a fence and a fishing boat. But another part of him knew this wasn't funny. These people meant business, and if he let them inside, there'd be no stopping them. So instead of answering, he flipped a switch inside his garage. A deafening siren blared to life, startling the men below. At the same time, motion-activated floodlights flickered on, bathing the area in harsh white light. The men shielded their eyes, stumbling backward in confusion. That's when things got interesting. One of the guards near the gate took a step forward, trying to look tough despite the chaos. His foot caught on one of James's tripwires, and suddenly, a bucket tipped over, dumping a cascade of slippery mud onto his head. The man yelped, slipping and falling flat on his back. Another guard rushed to help him but tripped himself, landing hard in the shallow trench James had dug earlier. Chaos erupted as the rest of the group tried to figure out what was happening. Some backed away nervously, while others pressed forward, determined not to look weak. James watched it all unfold from his porch, shaking his head. He wasn't proud of causing trouble, but he also wasn't going to apologize for defending his home. When the leader, Carter, according to the name tag on his uniform, realized his team was falling apart, he raised the megaphone again. "This isn't over!" Carter yelled, his voice cracking with frustration. "You can't keep us out forever." James finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. "I already told you you've got 10 seconds to leave my property. After that, I can't guarantee your safety." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, realizing James wasn't bluffing, Carter signaled for his men to retreat. But it was too late. As they scrambled to regroup, James stepped off the porch, grabbing his trusty baseball bat. It wasn't loaded with nails or modified in any way, it was just a plain old bat, worn smooth from years of use. Still, the sight of it made the guards hesitate. One of them lunged forward, clearly trying to prove himself. James sidestepped easily, swinging the bat with precision. It connected with the man's shin, sending him sprawling to the ground with a groan. Another guard charged, only to meet the same fate. Each swing was deliberate, aimed to disable rather than injure. James wasn't trying to hurt anyone, he just needed to send a message. By the time it was over, every single guard was on the ground, clutching various body parts and groaning in pain. Carter, who had hung back during the scuffle, tried to radio for backup. But before he could finish, James kicked the device out of his hand, sending it flying into the dirt. "I'm done playing nice," James said, his voice low and steady. "Tell your bosses if they want a war, they'll get one." Carter stared at him, wide-eyed, before limping back to the trucks. The rest of his team followed, dragging themselves along like wounded animals. Within minutes, the convoy roared to life, leaving behind clouds of dust as they sped away. When the noise faded and silence returned, James leaned against the porch railing, catching his breath. He hadn't planned for things to escalate this far, but he couldn't deny feeling a sense of satisfaction. For months, the HOA had treated him like a nuisance, someone who needed to be controlled. Now, they knew exactly who they were dealing with. Word of the incident spread quickly through Willow Creek. By lunchtime, half the town seemed to know what had happened. Some folks cheered James on, calling him a hero for standing up to the HOA. Others whispered worriedly, wondering if he'd gone too far. Either way, everyone agreed on one thing: the quiet little rancher had just made a very loud statement. That evening, as James sat on his porch once again, he reflected on the day's events. He wasn't naive enough to think this was the end of the fight. The HOA wouldn't give up easily, they never did. But for now, he'd earned himself a reprieve. And more importantly, he'd shown them that he wasn't someone to be pushed around. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, James allowed himself a small smile. This place, his home, was worth fighting for. And if the HOA wanted to come back, they'd better bring their best game. Because next time, he wouldn't hold back. The fallout from the showdown at James's ranch hit Willow Creek like a thunderclap. By the next morning, it felt like everyone in town was talking about it. News traveled fast in small communities, but this wasn't just gossip, it was drama of epic proportions. People debated over coffee at the diner, whispered about it during church services, and even brought it up at the grocery store checkout line. The story had all the ingredients for a local legend: an underdog standing his ground, a face-off with hired security, and a satisfying dose of comeuppance for the overzealous HOA. For James, though, the aftermath wasn't as simple as basking in victory. Sure, he'd sent the guards packing with broken shins and bruised egos, but that didn't mean the fight was over. If anything, he knew the HOA would be more determined than ever to make an example out of him. They couldn't let someone like James get away with defying them, it would set a dangerous precedent. So while the rest of Willow Creek buzzed with excitement, James braced himself for round 2. True to form, the HOA wasted no time filing formal complaints against him. They accused him of assault, vandalism, and obstruction, painting him as some kind of violent outlaw who refused to play by the rules. Letters arrived almost daily, each one thicker and angrier than the last. James read them briefly before tossing them aside. He wasn't worried about legal threats, he'd done nothing wrong. What bothered him more was how quickly the narrative shifted once the HOA went public with their version of events. Local news outlets picked up the story, running headlines like "Homeowner turns violent against HOA inspectors" and "Rancher causes chaos over fence dispute." Reporters camped outside James's property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man behind the controversy. Some neighbors started avoiding him altogether, afraid of being dragged into the mess. Others stopped by to offer support, bringing casseroles or words of encouragement. But even among his supporters, there were murmurs of concern. Was James going too far? Would this escalate further? What no one expected and what ultimately changed the game was the video footage that surfaced online. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone from a safe distance. It showed everything, the guards arriving uninvited, James calmly warning them to leave, and the chaos that erupted when they ignored him. The clip captured every tripwire, every muddy bucket, and every precise swing of James's bat. Most importantly, it showed the guards trespassing and escalating the situation, proving beyond doubt that James had acted in self-defense. Within hours, the video went viral not just locally, but nationally. Comment sections exploded with opinions. Some viewers criticized James for using force, arguing that violence was never the answer. But the majority sided with him, praising him for standing up to bullies. One commenter summed it up perfectly: if someone shows up at your house demanding to inspect your property without permission, you have every right to defend yourself. This guy didn't start the fight, he finished it. Public pressure mounted on the HOA. Local officials began receiving calls and emails from outraged citizens, accusing the organization of harassment and abuse of power. Even some of James's doubters started questioning whether the HOA had gone too far. After all, most people could relate to feeling frustrated by bureaucracy. Who hadn't dealt with unreasonable rules or pushy authority figures at some point? James's story resonated because it tapped into something universal: the desire to protect what's yours and live life on your own terms. Faced with mounting scrutiny, the HOA tried to double down, issuing statements defending their actions and insisting they were only doing their job. But the damage was done. Their credibility crumbled under the weight of public opinion. Within weeks, several board members resigned, citing personal reasons. Those who stayed faced growing demands for reform, including calls for greater transparency and accountability. Meanwhile, James found himself thrust into the spotlight, a role he neither sought nor enjoyed. Strangers stopped by his ranch to thank him for taking a stand. A few even asked for advice on how to deal with their own HOAs. At first, James brushed off the attention, telling people he was just an ordinary guy trying to protect his home. But eventually, he realized he had an opportunity to do more than simply defend himself. He could use this moment to spark change not just for himself, but for others in similar situations. James reached out to his neighbors, inviting them to a meeting at the community center. He didn't expect many people to show up, but to his surprise, the room was packed. Farmers, retirees, young families, all kinds of folks filled the seats, eager to hear what he had to say. James kept his message simple: the HOA's behavior wasn't just about him, it was symptomatic of a larger problem. Too often, these organizations wielded unchecked power, imposing arbitrary rules and punishing anyone who dared question them. It was time to hold them accountable. The meeting turned into a brainstorming session. Together, the group drafted a petition calling for reforms within the HOA. They demanded clearer guidelines, fairer enforcement, and better communication between the board and residents. James delivered the petition to the remaining HOA members personally, along with a stern warning: fix this, or we'll find someone else who will. To their credit, the HOA listened, or at least pretended to. New leadership was elected, promising to prioritize transparency and collaboration. Rules were reviewed and adjusted, and fines that had been issued unfairly were dropped. While not everyone trusted the changes immediately, most agreed it was a step in the right direction. As for James, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after becoming a local celebrity. The reporters eventually moved on to other stories, and the crowds thinned out. He went back to tinkering with his tractor, fishing off his dock, and enjoying quiet evenings on the porch. But something had shifted. His ranch wasn't just a refuge anymore, it was a symbol of resilience. Visitors still stopped by occasionally, asking if he regretted any of it. James always smiled and shook his head. Regret? No, he'd say. Respect? Always. And deep down, he meant it. Standing up to the HOA hadn't been easy, but it had reminded him of something important: freedom wasn't given, it was earned. And sometimes, earning it meant being willing to fight for it. The dust had settled, but the echoes of James's stand against the HOA lingered in Willow Creek for months. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a lesson, a turning point that reminded everyone how fragile and precious freedom could be. For James, life returned to its peaceful rhythm, though he couldn't help but notice subtle changes in the way people treated him. Neighbors who once kept their distance now waved warmly as they drove by. Some even stopped to chat, sharing stories of their own frustrations with the HOA or asking for advice on dealing with similar issues. James listened patiently, offering words of encouragement when needed, but mostly letting them know they weren't alone. One day, while he was fixing a loose board on his porch, an older woman named Ruth pulled up in her beat-up pickup truck. She'd been one of the first neighbors to support him during the conflict, bringing over cookies and kind words when tensions were high. This time, she came bearing something different, a stack of papers tied neatly with string. "I figured you might want to see these," she said, handing them over with a smile. "They're letters from folks around town. Some are thanking you, others are sharing their own battles with the HOA. Thought it might give you a laugh or at least remind you why all this mattered." James took the bundle, flipping through the pages curiously. There were heartfelt notes from people he barely knew, expressing gratitude for standing up not just for himself, but for everyone else too. One letter stood out. A young father wrote about how inspired he was to finally speak up after years of staying silent. Another came from a retired teacher who admitted she'd always felt intimidated by the HOA's rules until James showed her it was possible to push back. Reading those words filled James with a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't set out to become a hero, but if his actions gave others the courage to fight for what was right, then maybe all the chaos had been worth it. As spring turned into summer, the changes within the HOA began to take root. The new leadership made genuine efforts to rebuild trust, holding regular meetings where residents could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Rules that once seemed arbitrary were rewritten to reflect the needs of the community rather than the whims of a few board members. Fines were reduced or eliminated altogether, and disputes were resolved through conversation instead of threats. While some skeptics remained cautious, most agreed the atmosphere in Willow Creek felt lighter, freer. Still, James stayed vigilant. He knew better than to assume everything would stay perfect forever. Power had a way of creeping back in when no one was looking, and he didn't want to see the progress undone. So, he kept attending HOA meetings not because he enjoyed sitting through hours of discussion about landscaping guidelines, but because he believed accountability mattered. His presence alone served as a reminder: don't mess with the little guy unless you're prepared to face the consequences. Despite the lingering scars of the conflict, James found joy in the small things again. He spent mornings fishing by the lake, afternoons working on his tractor, and evenings watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues. Life wasn't perfect, there were still bills to pay and chores to do, but it was his. And that meant more to him than anything. Every now and then, someone new would move to Willow Creek and hear snippets of the infamous ranch showdown. Curious, they'd stop by James's place to ask questions, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who'd taken on the HOA. James welcomed them politely, offering lemonade or coffee depending on the weather. Most visitors left impressed not by his toughness, but by his humility. He never boasted about what happened or tried to make himself sound bigger than he was. Instead, he focused on the message: stand firm, treat others with respect, and don't let anyone take away your dignity. Years passed, and the story became part of Willow Creek's folklore. Parents told it to their kids as a bedtime tale, emphasizing the importance of standing up for what's right. Tourists passing through sometimes stopped to snap photos of the ranch, marveling at the place where one man had defied authority and won. James didn't mind the attention. He understood that legends often grew larger than reality, but he preferred to keep living quietly, enjoying the simple pleasures of his hard-earned peace. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, James sat on his porch reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the guards who'd shown up uninvited, the floodlights and tripwires, the muddy buckets and swinging bat. He thought about the letters, the petitions, the viral video that changed everything. But most of all, he thought about the people, the ones who supported him, the ones who doubted him, and the ones who found strength in his example. He leaned back in his chair, sipping a cup of coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. It struck him then how much the world had shifted since that fateful morning when 6 men in black uniforms arrived at his gate. Back then, he'd been fighting for his home, for his independence, for the right to live life on his own terms. Now, looking around at the thriving community he'd helped shape, he realized he'd fought for something bigger, the idea that ordinary people could rise up against injustice and win. James smiled faintly, feeling a deep sense of contentment wash over him. The battle scars were still there, the occasional ache in his shoulder from swinging the bat, the faded bruises on his conscience from the stress of it all, but so was the victory. Not just his, but theirs. Together, they'd proven that power didn't belong only to those who wore uniforms or carried clipboards. It belonged to anyone willing to stand tall, dig in their heels, and say, "Enough." And as the stars began to twinkle above the lake, James knew one thing for certain: he'd earned every moment of peace he enjoyed.